All right, you are good to go.
Okay, I want to thank the Sussex Library for inviting me. My name is Evan Weiner, and I'm a speaker, radio, TV, newspapers, magazines, and speak on cruise ships. And because I speak on cruise ships, I learned all about George Washington, Thomas Jefferson in Barbados. Jefferson never made it to Barbados. I've been to Barbados quite a few times because I speak on cruise ships, and I'm always looking for something else to do. And because I'm not a beach person, my wife's a beach person, I'm not a beach person. But I found out that George Washington spent about 6 weeks in Barbados. And during those 6 weeks that he was there, 1751, you could say that the fate of the United States changed with George Washington in Barbados. I'm just going to mute everybody. Hold on 1 second. Hold on, there's a problem here. Hold on 1 second. I got a problem that I have to fix here. Okay, I fixed it. That was something else. I'm sorry about that. Hold on. We'll get back to where I was in a moment, hopefully. Okay, I should be able to open this up. Resume share. Okay, so anyway, sorry about that. That was my fault. That was something else that was going on. Anyway, so getting back to Barbados, George Washington was there 1751. And George Washington, those 6 weeks that he was there would impact not only his life, but also the young country of the United States. The Washington Memorial, or rather Washington Monument, on the mall, the National Mall in D.C. Let's go back to Barbados. It was the crown jewel of the British Empire in North America. It's not on the land, it's an island in the chain. Barbados was intimately involved in the English Civil War, which resulted in the defeat and the execution of King Charles I in 1649, and the rise to power of Oliver Cromwell as Lord Protector. That war would come to Barbados, Bridgetown, in 1651 and would end up with the Charter of Barbados. Now, the royalists who supported King Charles fled to Barbados because if they stayed, they would have lost their heads. So the royalists became the opposition, and they buy property in Barbados. The Charter of Barbados was agreed upon on January 11th, 1652. And it was ratified at the bar? Why not? They're English, right? They're all Brits. So at the Mermaid Tavern in Oistins on January 17th, 1652, finally, the war ends in Barbados. Here's the strange thing about the Charter of Barbados. And stop me if you've heard this in history class, whatever history class you took in the United States. There were 23 articles in the Charter of Barbados, addressing religious liberty, Article 1, free trade, taxation, and the authority of the local assembly. Civil War and the Charter of Barbados are done on January 17th, 1652. Now, if you're on a cruise ship and you're deciding whether or not you're lazy and you're going to take the van back to the cruise ship or you're going to walk by a whole bunch of plaques. And the plaques tell you a little bit about Barbados, including rum and all that other stuff. This one I found really interesting. From this vantage point, you could have witnessed one of the naval theaters of the English Civil War, 1642 through 1651. Sir George Askew commanded a naval blockade of the island of Barbados from his ship, the Rainbow, in Oistins Bay, from October 1651 to January 1652. Askew's naval forces were sent to subdue the local royalists, led by the governor, Lord Willoughby. The stalemate ended in a treaty between the royalists and the parliamentary factions. After the final conflict in Oistins, the Charter of Barbados was signed on 11 January 1652 at the Mermaid Tavern in Oistins. It guaranteed Barbadian colonists their rights to land, local control of taxation, liberty of conscience, access to courts of law, and free limited trade. Local control of taxation. That phrase was turned into something else. Taxation without representation. Liberty of consciousness or of conscience, of course, applies to religion. The treaty that no taxes, customs, imports, or loans or excise shall be laid nor levied made on the inhabitants of this island without consent, their consent in the General Assembly. Article 3 of the Charter of Barbados, signed at the tavern at Oistins on January 17th, 1652. Is that where the Boston Tea Party started? Good questions. The Mermaid Tavern was the site of the battle between the Royalists and the Roundheads, which resulted in the charter. The articles of rendition of the island from proprietary rights to the Commonwealth Parliament also happened on January 11, 1652. The treaty signed ensured that Barbados accepted the authority of the English Parliament, but it also prevented local taxes from being raised without local consent. Now, this is 1652. 124 years later, Thomas Jefferson is writing a lot of the same stuff. Question is, how did Jefferson find out about it? The Treaty of Oistins was negotiated and signed at the Mermaid Tavern, as you know, and its concept of no taxation without representation was the inspiration for the Boston Tea Party, 1773, and subsequently included in the American Declaration of Independence in 1776. They got the date wrong in Barbados, but they're not teaching American history in Barbados. So where does Thomas Jefferson fit into all of this? Well, if you go to the Jefferson Memorial in Washington, D.C., there is nothing about the Charter of Barbados. Absolutely nothing about it. The charter probably did influence the American Declaration of Independence because historians believe that George Washington, on his visit to Barbados in 1751, would have been acquainted with the charter. At least that's what Barbadian historians think. Now, how did Washington get there? Well, he kind of drew the short straw. See, his half-brother, Lawrence Washington, was suffering from tuberculosis and was advised to spend the winter in the tropics. They'll cure you. Go down there. Have fun in the sun. His 19-year-old half-brother, George Washington, agreed to go. Well, why wasn't Lawrence Washington's wife with him? Why weren't his kids? Well, his wife had a hard time in childbirth, and a couple of the babies were stillborn and or did not make it. So she had two healthy kids, and she wasn't going to risk having their health impacted by going on a boat trip for about 6 weeks. So the Washington brothers apparently sailed on a boat called the Success, small trading sloop. The voyage takes more than 6 weeks on what George Washington called the fickle and merciless. Check out how that's spelled. Mercili, not Less, ocean. If the two Washingtons decided to leave, say, from Hampton on a cruise ship, Hampton, Virginia, they would get there in 3 days. This took 6 weeks. And they end up at this place, Gedney Clark's house. And Gedney Clark was related to Lawrence Washington. He had money. Lawrence Washington had money. So it was easy. Lawrence Washington was going to convalesce in this place. George Washington recorded the weather, details about sailing, the fish they caught or tried to catch, dolphin, pilotfish, shark, barracuda, or tigerfish. And on November 2nd, 1751, they dock. And it wasn't a second too early for that. Hang on, we'll admit all of them. Anyway, the chances are that the Washington brothers did not see the sun, but this is where they landed. Carlisle Bay, Barbados. And it says Barbados is surrounded by 200-meter deep shelf located about 2 or 3 kilometers offshore. There are 3 types of reefs. The barrier reef, the patch reef, and the fringing reef. That causes problems when you want to go into Barbados. There's coral there, and there's all kind of other stuff. But the odds are they didn't see that sign. Nor, well, it is possible that they swum in, or George Washington could have swam in Carlisle Bay. The English settled the army in 1627, but it was not really doing all that much to the island until about 2 decades later, when sugar became king, and sugar and the slave trade industry was the economy. And Barbados had the best or hottest economy of all the islands in the Caribbean. Barbados was one of Britain's most precious colonial possessions. Bridgetown, where the ships land today and always land, where the Washingtons landed, was one of the most populous cities in, or populated cities in North America, or British America, excuse me for 1 second. Gedney Clark, the uncle of Lawrence Washington's wife, invited them to the house. They went, although George Washington was thinking, I don't know much about this place. I'm kind of reluctant because Mrs. Clark had smallpox, and there really wasn't a cure for smallpox. Within 2 weeks, George Washington comes down with the disease. So here he is, 6 weeks on the water. She's got the smallpox. He catches the smallpox. Examining, but while he was healthy, George Washington, for some reason, was taken in by the British military. And he examined the island's defenses and concluded that Barbados was actually one entire, I-N-T-I-R-E, entire instead of E-N-T-I-R-E, fortification. It was right. I mean, they were armed to the teeth. And there is Lawrence Washington, who got sick. While in Barbados, Washington explored the economics of sugarcane and the role of Barbados in the Atlantic economy. Additionally, he explored the forts and military structures of the island. So he wasn't there for a vacation. He was there to learn. After all, he was going to be a farmer, or so he thought he was going to be a farmer. But this military stuff, he starts getting interested in it. Now, well, you can see one of the cannons fell, but you see a lot of this still to this day in Barbados, where you got the cannons and they are overlooking the water because they're going to be attacked. Lawrence Washington and George Washington, we go home separately. George lasted about 4 to 6 weeks and then decided he had had enough. He went home. Lawrence Washington went home a little later, and he would die of tuberculosis in his home in Mount Vernon, Virginia, July 1752. George Washington's provincial world was expanded. And while he was in Bridgetown, he met a lot of people, and they liked him, and they were influential people. And those people would be around Washington for the rest of his career. High society. The young George Washington, who never went to a posh school in England because his parents couldn't afford it, dined frequently at the Clark's Bridgetown home. And while he was eating, he met colonial officers, judges, merchants, military officers, and planters. After returning to Virginia, he decides, that military life looks to be pretty good, and I want to be a military guy. And he applied himself, and he was rapid in learning about everything, more so than any of his Virginia contemporaries. George also wanted to seek a commission in the regular British military establishment. After all, George Washington was a Brit. That's what he was. He was a Brit. An ambition that probably was prompted and undoubtedly stimulated by his experience in Barbados. 1752. George Washington is 20 years old, just 20 years old. But George Washington was 6'4". He towered over everybody. And he was an impressive looking guy because of that. In December 1752, the 20-year-old Washington, and no previous military experience, was made a commander of the Virginia militia. He saw action in the French and Indian War and was eventually put in charge of all of Virginia's militia forces. And there is an early painting of George Washington. In 1753, George Washington, age 21, was sent as an ambassador from the British Crown. After all, George Washington was a Brit, to the French officials and Indians near what is now present Erie, Pennsylvania, which is not close to his home in Virginia. In 1754, at the age of 22, he was to assist in the construction of a fort at what is now Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, Mount Washington, which overlooks the city. And George Washington may have inadvertently started the French Indian War or the 7-Year War. Amazing, right? Here's this guy at this point, he's just a young guy, and yet he may have done it. This is how he could have done it. 1754, Washington's surprise attack upon a French force at Jumbleville Glen, up in Pennsylvania, and his subsequent surrender to the French forces at the Battle of Fort Necessary helped spark the French and Indian War, which was part of the imperial conflict between Great Britain and France, known as the 7-Year War. The French responded by attacking fortifications Washington erected following the ambush, forcing his surrender. He's released on parole, goes back to Virginia, and starts thinking about his future. He becomes a surveyor, but gets involved in the military again because there's another war, the French and Indian War, 1756, and he wants to be in the action. In his first year in command of the Virginia Regiment, Washington shaped the unit into one of the best provincial military units in the colonies, and the Brits needed that in the war against the French and the Indians. He rigorously disciplined, often punishing transgressions with a lash, but also sometimes hanging them. He hanged people if they converted, if they deserted. So if he caught them, hey, he had no problems hanging him from a tree. But he had a problem with this guy, Robert Dinwiddie. He's the provincial governor of Virginia. And George and the governor don't see eye to eye. And George wasn't very good on the battlefield. He lost more than he won, which would continue in the Revolutionary War. So he has fights with the governor, Robert Dinwiddie, and he returns to Williamsburg, resigns from the Virginia militia, and that should be it. Never again going to hear from George Washington. He's done. He's done. But the English and French certainly aren't done. So he meets the wealthy widow, Martha. And George liked money. There's no question George liked money. He liked high society. Martha was part of high society. January 6, 1759, he married Martha Dandridge Custis. And he also gets into politics in 1759. He becomes a member of the Virginia House of Burgesses. And for the next 16 years, he lived the life of a plantation owner and a politician. So while he's back at the plantation, he's missing all the action. And he undoubtedly would have been in the action had he survived in the English army and got the commission. Up in Quebec City, that's Quebec City, the upper cities compared to the lower city. Quebec City becomes the flashpoint where North American history, at least east of the Mississippi, is changed. Oh Canada, this glorious national anthem. And there's a plaque on the Plains of Abraham. And undoubtedly, George Washington would have been on the Plains of Abraham had he continued his arc up. There's the fortress, Quebec City, and the citadel and the wall, which was supposed to keep Quebec City French. But the general, Montcalm, is defeated here on that spot, Plains of Abraham, received his mortal wound, 13th September, 1759. 1759, Washington gets married. He's now a politician. He should be in Quebec City. The British, under the command of James Wolfe, besieged Quebec City for 3 months. The city was defended by the French general, the Marquis de Montcalm. That's Frontenac back there, and this is actually the Plains of Abraham, where the battle would take place to change the history of North America, at least the eastern part. See that down there? It's the St. Lawrence Seaway. Used to be the St. Lawrence River before it was widened in the 1950s. Anyway, there are a bunch of cliffs that lead you up to the old city, and or actually the upper city. And the French thought that the cliffs were so steep, there's no way they could be attacked from the river with people coming up. They would know, so they don't continue that citadel. In 1605, the French colonists established the first permanent European settlement in the future Canada and the first north of Florida at Port Royal, founding what would become known as Acadia, Nova Scotia. So the French are heavily involved in Nova Scotia and Quebec. The English don't like that. Louisbourg, Nova Scotia, Cape Breton. French settlement, 1713. 1730, the biggest military fortress falls, 1758. 1713 Treaty of Utrecht gave the French Cape Breton and Prince Edward Island. That is the fort that fell back in 1758. It was rebuilt 1/4 scale because the mining industry was gone and people needed jobs. So they figured, well, let's rebuild that and give them a job. Louisbourg was captured by the British, 1758, demolished. Some of it's been reconstructed. Longfellow, and you must have Longfellow works in your library, wrote Evangeline about the exile. See, the British practiced ethnic cleansing in Nova Scotia. There's the lighthouse across the way from the fort. If you ever go to Halifax and you walk on the waterway, you will come to a whole bunch of we're sorry plaques. We're sorry we did this. We're sorry we did that. We didn't mean to do this. As far as getting rid of all the French in Nova Scotia, well, we did, but we really didn't mean to do that. But some of the French did get to France. Some of them got down to where Louisiana is today and the Cajun culture. The French and Indian War was a war in which England finally defeated the French in Canada and the Mississippi and Great Lakes line. The English take what is now known as Canada. Washington never gets a commission in the English army, despite being the commander of chief of all forces in defense of Her Majesty's colony in Virginia. War is done. 1763, for the first time in years, England is not fighting a war. But there's a problem. The English colonists, the southern colonists, as opposed to the northern colonists, that'd be the Nova Scotia, Quebec people, weren't too happy with what was going on in the southern colonies. Treaty of Paris ended the French and Indian War, and England has to now face up to the fact that these wars cost them a lot of money, and they got to do something to get the money back. The Treaty of Paris ends the French and Indian War between Great Britain and France. Great Britain, first time in 50 years, is not at war. So how do we regulate the empire? How do we get money out of the colonies, particularly the northern colonies? Why? Because there's money in the northern colonies. These people went to England there, got land, they're landowners. John Hancock, they have a lot of money. 7 Years' War, conflict with France and Britain incurred enormous debt. And where do we pay? Where do we find people who could pay for the debt? Colony of Massachusetts, colony of New Jersey, colony of New York. Yeah, you know what? They'll pay for the war. That won't be a problem. In the southern colonies, they're watching very closely what happened in Nova Scotia and in Quebec. The southern colonists know that England now runs Quebec, and they chased all the French from Nova Scotia. Proclamation of 1763. You see the southern colonies are right there. Parliament issues the Proclamation of 1763, prohibiting settlement in the American colonies west of the Appalachian Mountains. George Washington doesn't like that. In fact, a lot of people living in Virginia are not too happy with the Brits with that decision. Patrick Henry, give me liberty or give me death. Well, 1765, Parliament imposes the Stamp Act for taxing the American colonies. Patrick Henry introduces the Stamp Act resolves, sorry about that, in the Virginia House of Burgesses, and these resolves challenge Great Britain's right to impose the tax. Taxation without representation. Oh, by the way, who lived in Virginia in 1765? Thomas Jefferson. Parliament repealed the Stamp Act, but passes the Declaratory Act in 1776, which asserts Great Britain's right to pass any laws governing the American colonies. They're beginning to tighten the screws, and the Americans, it's not the American colonies, it's Southern colonies, actually. There's no America at this point. And anyway, they're tightening the screws, and the Southern colonists aren't too happy. 1767, Parliament imposes the Townshend duties taxing imports of tea, glass, paper, lead, and paint in the Southern colonies. Washington also probably knew the English pulled their best troops out of North America. There is Washington, 1760s. Martha and his two stepchildren. By the late 1760s, Washington starts experiencing firsthand the effects of rising taxes imposed upon the colonists by the British. And he starts to think it could very well be in our best interest to get out of here, get away from the English, and start our own country. 1767, he opposed the Stamp Act and the Townshend Act, as well as the 1774 Intolerable Act. So Washington decides he's going to go look for some allies. Where does he go? He goes to Pittsburgh. And my background is a reporter. I've done TV, I've done radio, newspapers, magazines. And see, I'm able to listen in to Washington talking to one of his Indian allies about the future and how they can help him and how they could be helped by George Washington. 1773, Parliament passes the Tea Act. The Boston Tea Party takes place in Boston, Massachusetts. A party of nearly 50 men disguised as Indians, led by Samuel Adams, get on ships. They break open 343 cases of tea, dump them into the Boston Harbor. If you want that experience, for $10 to cross the river by the Children's Museum. They give you $10. They'll put you on the ships. They'll give you some tea. You can dump it, all for $10. Seeking to boost the trouble, the East India Company, British Parliament adjusts the import duties. The consignees in Charleston, New York, and Philadelphia just said, we just don't want this tea. But merchants in Boston said, we're going to take the tea. We'll be okay. We'll take the tea. Oh, that was Samuel Adams, who's now a beer. But before he was a beer, he was a troublemaker in Boston. On the night of December 16, 1773, Samuel Adams and the Sons of Liberty boarded 3 ships in the Boston Harbor and threw 343 chests of tea overboard. Didn't make George III very happy. In fact, George III was not happy at all. And the Parliament would pass the punitive Coercive Acts in 1774. And these acts were intended to punish the colony of Massachusetts and Boston in particular for the Tea Party. And there were a bunch of rabble-rousers there, a lot of resistance, like Samuel Adams. They had to do something about it. Now, in Massachusetts, there's kind of a split as to who was the first to be the rebel-rouser. Was it Samuel Adams in 1773? Or was it in 1774, August 6, 1774? Berkshire County, Great Barrington. Near the spot stood the first courthouse of Berkshire County, erected 1764. Here, August 16th, 1774, occurred the first open resistance to British rule in America. Now, maybe you can help me with this. Maybe news traveled slowly between Boston and Great Barrington, 120 miles apart. Because maybe it's me. I don't know. You might be able to answer this for me. I thought 1773 came before 1774, and that the Boston Tea Party would be the first resistance, not whatever happened in Great Barrington. But again, that's me. Skirmishes between British troops and colonial militiamen in Lexington and in Concord, April 1775, kicked off the armed conflict. And there is George III. By the way, I don't know if you know this about George III, but he needed glasses. He was nearsighted, which plays into this in a couple of minutes. But here is George III. The Second Continental Congress meets in Philadelphia, 1775. Peyton Randolph is reelected president of Congress. And George Washington comes out of retirement and is named commander-in-chief of the American forces. King George III declares the American colonies in rebellion. George is ready for this role. George wants it. After all, he's got charm. He's got power. He's got charisma. And there's also nobody else who could do the job. Washington appeared at the Second Continental Congress in a military uniform. He was going to show them he's all prepared for war. He's got the prestige. He's got the military experience. He's got charisma. Remember, he closely observed British military tactics back in Barbados, gaining a keen insight into their strengths and weaknesses, French and Indian War as well, that proved invaluable during the Revolution. Oh, yeah, and that other thing that he got in Barbados, smallpox, he was immune. Go out there. He was immune. He wasn't going to get it. The Liberty Bell, Philadelphia, Independence Hall. July 4th, 1776, the Jefferson Declaration of Independence is released. Town crier. Oh, George III got a copy as well. Why July 4th? Everybody had to get out of Philadelphia. And they did a couple days earlier because, hey, these were all Brits, right? For the most part. Because if they were captured, they could be hanged. Which leads me to the question. Was George Washington a traitor? Was John Adams a traitor, the lawyer? Was Thomas Jefferson a traitor? Were they traitors, yes or no? And there is the Declaration of Independence, July 4th, 1776. And the biggest name there on this particular copy, John Hancock. Why is his name there in terms of being the biggest? Oh, sure, he's the president of the General Congress, but he knew that George III was nearsighted. He was also the richest guy in America, by far. And he wanted George III to make sure in his big John Hancock signature that John Hancock signed this, and he was mad at the king, and he had had it with England. He wanted to be somewhere else, America. Now, about George Washington, he wasn't very good on the battlefield. Didn't win that much on the battlefield, but he had the ability to keep the struggling colonial army together. His troops, poorly trained, lacked food, lacked ammunition and other supplies. Sometimes they didn't have shoes in the winter, but Washington was able to give them direction and motivation to keep them going, which made him a great general. He also got a lot of help. This guy from Germany, Baron von Steuben, somewhere around Hackensack, Teaneck, there's a von Steuben place, probably more Hackensack. Anyway, he's a former Prussian army officer who came to America in December 1777 to help the cause, known as the drill master of Valley Forge for his role in introducing European concepts of military discipline to American troops. So how did he come to America? Well, Ben Franklin, good old Ben Franklin's in France, and he's sweet-talking everybody. Remember, Ben Franklin once wrote, "A woman never loses her beauty from the neck down." And apparently he's being wooed by some people in this picture in France. France he gets to help. They provide money, troops, armament, military leadership, and naval support, which tips the balance of military power in favor of the United States. and paves the way for the Continental Army's ultimate victory. The surrender of Lord Cornwallis is in 1791. George Washington and the ragtag troops, with help from people like von Steuben and the French, ultimately prevail. But that's in 1781. It would take another 2 years for England to sign the deal with America. But the war is just about done with the English defeat in Yorktown, Virginia. Time to say goodbye. It's time to go home. And of course, being Brits, and they were no longer Brits at this point, they were Americans, you say goodbye in the proper place, Francis Tavern. By the way, the rank and file people who were living in North America at that point didn't care. Didn't care whether it was English, whether it was American. They just didn't care. Didn't apply to them. Applied to the rich landowners who didn't want to pay taxes. That's what the war was for about. It was a civil war between the rich people who went to America against King George III over taxes. Washington says goodbye at a tavern. Oh, that tavern becomes the seat of the government. After all, these guys were once British. Today, it's still a bar and a museum. So George goes home. He's had it. He's gone home. Hey, after all, the war is over. He's 51 years old. He hasn't seen Martha in 7 years. I don't know if he missed her or not, but he hasn't seen her in 7 years. So he goes home. The Americans are looking. The country is struggling, and they're trying to keep these 13 colonies together. Vermont was not part of it. Vermont was land that actually New Hampshire and New York fought over, and these people said, we don't want either one of you. We'll become an independent republic, and they did. After much reluctance, George Washington was persuaded to attend the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia during the summer of 1787 as a delegate from Virginia. And there he was, 6'4". He's already 55 years old at this point, and they're looking at him saying, George, come, we want you to run this place. After much reluctance, there wasn't much reluctance. George gets out there and he decides to speak his mind. Criticism, Articles of Confederation of the 13 colonies. It was a weak central government. And he said to the Articles of about the Articles of Confederation that it's no more than a rope of sand supporting a new nation. He had a lot of problems getting money for his army. Washington's view for the need of a strong federal government grew out of that recent war. The inability of the Continental Congress to rally states, they were all individual, particularly South Carolina, to provide the needs for the military got him going. George Washington, George Washington took the oath of office, President of the United States, on the steps of Federal Hall in Lower Manhattan, adjacent to Wall Street. Washington would basically invent the federal government, appointed all the high-ranking officials in the executive and judicial branches. He shaped numerous political practices which are still used to this day. And he had an ally along the way. This guy here, Alexander Hamilton from Nevis, next to St. Kitts, ends up in Bermuda and finds Washington during the Revolutionary War. And Hamilton had his ear. George Washington supported Alexander Hamilton's economic policies, whereby the federal government assumed the debts of the state governments. Hamilton established the first bank of the United States Mint, and the United States Customs Service. And if you don't want to pay an arm and a leg to see Hamilton on Broadway, go see him for nothing. That's the Customs House in Lower Manhattan, and it's also part of the Smithsonian. It's a gorgeous building, and it's been renovated. When I lived on the Lower East Side as a kid, and my grandmother worked at DMV, so I would pass this place every once in a while. It was decrepit. It is beautiful now. Washington is in retirement after his presidency. His job, managed the plantation, 5 farms, 8,000 acres, grist mill, distillery, fishery. the manor house, gardens, scores of outbuildings, and several hundred slaves. It's a full-time job. But John Adams, who's now president, as Washington is in retirement, and Alexander Hamilton need to talk to him. And they said to George, hey, listen, you're going to have to come back. You're going to have to save the country. France is mad at us, and we expect a war with France. George doesn't want to be bothered with this after all. We are now talking about 1797. And George is now 65 years old. He wants to retire. He tells them, I don't know. Hey, you know what? And the other thing, French aren't going to invade. So he's in retirement. So he thinks, but not for long. In November 1798, George Washington is in Philadelphia, and he's meeting with two major generals, Alexander Hamilton and Charles Cotesworth Pinckney of South Carolina. And they are going to formulate plans for raising the new army regiments authorized by Congress and choose officers for those regiments. So they meet daily for 6 weeks. Every day they put in their time. They made the recommendation in a series of reports to the Secretary of War, but nothing happened. So it goes back to the farm. And George may have set the precedent for today's politicians to go wherever they go to express themselves as partisan hacks. 1799, he begins pushing his candidates for Congress. He becomes a partisan hack. He would die at the age of 67 in 1799. Washington is one of the greatest presidents, historians will tell you, and that stay in Barbados, which is understated in elementary schools, junior high schools, and high schools, was extraordinarily important. It was only 6 weeks. But Washington met the right people and saw what military was all about. But it ain't over until it's over, said that the one-time philosopher Lawrence Peter, better known as Yogi, the museum at Montclair State. England wanted revenge, and the United States wanted to expand. Washington's dead, but a lot of people are still left over from the Washington years. And another war was coming. The War of 1812. Star-Spangled Banner and all that. The War of 1812. In June 1812, the United States declared war against Great Britain in reaction to 3 issues. The British blockade of France. Brits and French never really settled their differences through this point. The imprisonment of thousands of neutral American seamen into the British Royal Navy against their will. They just kidnapped these people. And the British support of hostile Indian tribes along the Great Lakes frontier. Now, what was going on in the Great Lakes? Well, fur, fox fur, other fur. It made a lot of money, and people wanted the foxes or the carcasses of the foxes. The White House was burnt down in 1814. The War of 1812, a faction of the U.S. Congress made up mostly of Western and Southern congressmen, had been advocating the declaration of war for years. The Revolutionary War, which Washington won, wasn't good enough. It hadn't ended. The 36-year-old United States in 1812 declared war on Britain because of British interference with American merchant ships and literally enslaving them, the men, into the British Royal Navy. So here's the plan for the United States. The plan was to conquer the land now known as Canada and wrest that land away from England, and it would be the United States all the way up to the North Pole. Of course, it never happened. While Washington was dealing with the revolution back 1776 to 1783, there were people in Nova Scotia. Remember, Nova Scotia is just across the river from what was then Massachusetts, which is now Maine, and people knew each other. And Nova Scotia was thinking, should we or shouldn't we? Should we or shouldn't we? Should we or shouldn't we? 14th colony. Well, Washington looked at Nova Scotia during the war very seriously, but the United States didn't need Halifax as a port. Halifax is one of the best deep water ports, never freezes, in the world. But there was Boston, there was New York, there was Philadelphia, Charleston, South Carolina. So there really wasn't a need for that port. So the English, they were able to hang on, and that's the Major General Robert Ross. Probably is not known for anything in the United States. And his target was the White House. In 1814, Washington, D.C. falls to the British. British troops burn the White House under Ross's command, the Capitol, and other buildings in retaliation for earlier burnings of government buildings up in the Toronto area and Canada by U.S. soldiers. And then there's, of course, Fort William McKendree and the battle that takes shape at Fort William McKendree. That's my daughter many years ago. And the flag. It's a 15-star flag. The British would retreat. Fort McHenry in Baltimore in the harbor withstood a massive British bombardment and inspired Francis Scott Key to pen the Star-Spangled Banner, which would become the national anthem in 1931. It ain't over till it's over. I think that guy Yogi said that. September 11th, 1814, the tide of the war turned when an American naval force under Thomas McDonough won a decisive victory at the Battle of Plattsburgh on Lake Champlain. The great British Navy is defeated by the upstarts, the Americans. A large British army under Sir George Prevost abandoned the invasion of the United States. The Northeast retreated to Canada, and that basically was it. Meanwhile, in Nova Scotia, on the other side of the river, they ask, why aren't we Americans? And this guy Ross and others are proud heroes. They're proud heroes. They stood up to the Americans. The other thing is, why aren't we Americans? Because we won the war. Ask the Canadians who won the war. They weren't even a country. But they'll tell you, we won the war. Well, how'd you win the war? Well, the United States never invaded us again. Good point. Albert Gallatin, U.S. envoy, signs the Treaty of Ghent, December 24th, 1814, back to the 1812 borders. Britain gives up the American land near the border in the Great Lakes. The U.S. gives up Ontario and returns land to Spain and Florida. James Madison signs the agreement February 17th, 1815. But hey, Old Hickory didn't hear of this at all. Andrew Jackson didn't hear about this at all. He's still thinking they're fighting a war. Old Hickory said we could take them by surprise. News of the treaty took almost 2 months to cross the Atlantic, and British forces were not informed of the end of the hostilities in time to end their drive against the mouth of the Mississippi River. On January 8th, 1815, a large British army attacked New Orleans, but was decimated by an inferior American force under Andrew Jackson, the general, in the most spectacular U.S. victory of the war. Except it wasn't necessary. In fact, it never should have happened. But then if it didn't happen, this guy would not have had a #1 hit. In 1959, Johnny Horton called the Battle of New Orleans. The Brits did help the South during the Civil War, but the Brits and the Americans eventually would become friends, and that's Boston. Every year, somebody comes out of that building to read the Declaration of Independence to people in the square. No hard feelings, no hard feelings. Queen Elizabeth spent July 4th, 1776 in Boston. President Gerald Ford and Queen Elizabeth toasted one another in Washington a few days later. And that was it. That was it. The last of the hostilities. As far as Washington, well, Washington, like I said, one of the greatest presidents. Hamilton, if you remember the play Hamilton and Jefferson hated one another. And Hamilton said, you take the capital down to wherever you want in that swamp down there on the Potomac, we'll keep the money here. Another interesting thing about Alexander Hamilton, Remember I said Washington became a political hack? Well, Hamilton didn't like Thomas Jefferson. He didn't like him so much that he decided that he and his friends needed to start a newspaper. The newspaper they started was the New York Evening Post. It is now the oldest newspaper, continuous newspaper in America as the New York Post. Barbados is important.